many of us wonder whether we as lay people can attain nirvana, the ultimate goal of the early Buddhist path. While early Buddhism tended to focus more on the monastic path, as we'll see, there are fascinating clues in the early texts that show that lay people as well could achieve profound spiritual progress. So in this video, I'm going to look at some of those early texts, what they have to say to us, turn a little bit at the end to some of the later traditions, as well as what this all has to do with us today and our practice right now. First, I want to look at the relationship between nirvana and monasticism in the early texts. Because if we do indeed spend time reading these early texts, we'll find that for the most part they're aimed at monastics. And it's monastics who are the ones that the Buddha expects to be able to and eventually to attain nirvana. The Buddha himself, when he started out, he left home, and his concern was that he left home because home life was difficult for him. As he says, life at home is cramped and dirty. Life gone forth, that is to say, into a monastic existence, is wide open. It's not easy for someone living at home to lead the spiritual life utterly full and pure like a polished shell. Why don't I shave off my hair and beard, dress in ochre robes, and go forth from the lay life to homelessness? That is, this spiritual life, utterly full and pure, is not easy to achieve as a layperson. Most of us in our lay lives are beset by attachments and concerns to worldly matters. We have family ties, we have livelihoods, we have social issues that we have to pay attention to, that draw us away perhaps from our spiritual practice, that perhaps draw us away from our ethical center in various respects. All of these attachments and concerns make a truly mindful lay life very challenging. And these attachments and concerns are only heightened in a modern world of social media and rampant consumerism. As the wanderer Vacchagotta asked the Buddha in one sutta in the Pali tradition, are there any lay people who, without giving up the fetter of lay life, make an end of suffering when the body breaks up? That is, are there any such lay people who are able to achieve nirvana and die having achieved it? And the Buddha denies that this is the case. However, this really should not be surprising because as Vacchagotta has asked the question, he's asked if they have this fetter of lay life. And as we may know, it's these very fetters to one thing and another in the world that bring us suffering for the Buddha. Any fetter is going to bring suffering, so anyone with a fetter is not thereby able to or having attained nirvana. The same would be true of someone with a fetter to monastic life. That is, anyone with a fetter or an attachment to being a monk or to wearing the robes would also not be able to attain nirvana. Now, having looked at some of the ways that nirvana and the highest goals tended to be restricted to monastic practitioners, we should now turn to the ways that lay people as well were able to attain very high achievements within early Buddhist texts. There are a number of texts in which, indeed, lay people attain what is known as the second highest of the attainments within early Buddhism, that of non-returning. That is, they would have extinguished all but the very highest of the fetters. As the Buddha says, there are not just 100 such celibate lay people who are my disciples, but 2 or 3 or 4 or 500, but many more than that. That is, the Buddha is saying here that more than 500 laymen and laywomen were able to achieve non-returning under his guidance. That is, they were able to achieve a level of proficiency in which they were only subject to the 5 highest fetters. Now, in order to achieve this, the Buddha seems to be saying they would have to remain celibate, but nevertheless they could do so and remain lay people. There would still be a kind of a residual sense of I, of a self within them, even though they no longer believed in a view of a permanent self, there would still be, again, this kind of residual sense of an I that was restricting them in certain respects, in particular in the respect of conceit, of this comparing mind. And also, from a traditional standpoint, they would have been subject to only one additional rebirth. That is, it was called non-returning because when they passed away in this life, the Buddha said to have claimed that they would be reborn once in a formless realm and then achieve nirvana and enlightenment from there. Traditionally, this level of non-returning is considered to be the highest level that a layperson can achieve. However, such a claim is never made in the suttas. So far as I can tell, the earliest place it appears is in the Questions of King Milinda, which is a later text that stems from around the 1st century BCE to the 2nd century of the Common Era. In that text, the monk Nagasena says that if a layperson were to attain nirvana, they would have either to become a monastic that same day, or they would have to pass away that same day. But the reasoning that Nagasena gives for this is somewhat thin. It's, again, not found in the suttas, and Nagasena says that this is the case because a layperson simply doesn't have the psychological capacity or strength to maintain enlightenment without being a monastic. And this reasoning does not make, to my mind anyhow, a whole lot of sense, because it would seem to me to be rather the reverse. That is, you would think that attaining enlightenment would give one an imperturbability of mind that would outweigh anything that could be given to one by simply taking on ordination and robes. But in any event, that's what Nagasena says. Notwithstanding such claims by Nagasena, there are certain texts within the Pali tradition that seem to claim that lay people can attain enlightenment. In one such text, the Buddha talks about a wise lay follower, an upasaka, and he says that this person has the wisdom of arising and passing away, which is noble, penetrative, and leads to the complete ending of suffering. If they have this wisdom that leads to the complete ending of suffering, this seems to align very closely with the concept of having attained nirvana itself. And it certainly seems from this sutta as though there are, at least possibly, such lay people. Perhaps the strongest evidence of lay people attaining nirvana is a list of 21 such lay people that the Buddha says have attained freedom from death and live having realized freedom from death. And this language is once again typically reserved only for those who've become arahants, that is, those who've become enlightened. Now, some scholars, in particular Richard Gombrich, considers these passages to be potentially spurious, that is, later interpolations, in that they only exist within the Pali tradition. It's unclear, however, to me, why some later monastic would interpolate a list of enlightened lay people. It seems to me more likely that later monastics might remove such lists from potential translations they would make into other languages. However, it's impossible to know for sure. Third, I want to turn to some developments within later Buddhism. It's impossible for me to get into any kind of depth here because, of course, there's so much material, but at least I wanted to touch on some aspects of the Mahayana path in which it does seem that they lean more into a practice being centered around lay life rather than monastic life. Perhaps key in this respect is what's known as the Vimalakirti Sutra, in which a layperson, Vimalakirti, has attained to extremely high levels of attainment, being basically on a level with the highest of the Buddha's disciples or the highest of the bodhisattvas. Indeed, Vimalakirti is even greater than the highest in certain respects. For example, within this sutra, Vimalakirti has competitions with both Sariputta, who was lauded as one of the Buddha's disciples who was greatest in wisdom, and he bests him in an argument. And he also even does better than Manjushri, who is the bodhisattva of wisdom, the bodhisattva who embodies wisdom. He isn't up to the wisdom of Vimalakirti. This centering of lay practice is something of a radical departure from the early texts. However, it's important to realize that within the Mahayana, the ideals of enlightenment and of nirvana themselves have been radically reinterpreted, as opposed to their early interpretations, so it's rather difficult to say directly and to compare directly and ask whether we can attain nirvana, since the ideals of nirvana are quite different in the early Buddhism from its Mahayana developments. What this does show, however, is that within the Mahayana, enlightenment and nirvana are more open to everyone, to different practice styles. And this represents a broader interpretation of the path to enlightenment. Fourth, let's recap here. Can a layperson attain nirvana? If we look at the early texts, what we find is that nirvana is generally restricted to those professional practitioners who became monastics. However, the early texts are also replete with lay people who have made great strides towards spiritual progress and perhaps even to attaining enlightenment and nirvana itself. For most of us, the path may not lead directly to nirvana, but even so, practices such as generosity, virtue, and mindfulness can help bring greater peace and clarity to our lives. So I would recommend that rather than fixating on the specific question about whether we as lay people can attain nirvana, instead we look to practices right here and right now that can help our spiritual development. Any such practices can enrich our lives in various respects, even while and even if that final goal remains distant. Now, if you want to hear a story of a layperson who was wise enough to be able to teach monastics himself, I did a video about it a while back. I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.